China is deploying more than 100 naval and Coast Guard vessels across East Asian waters, and actually it could form a part of their Navy at some point. This is all coming from a Reuters article. So this Reuters article talks about China's massing military across the region in a show of maritime force. Intelligence reviewed by Reuters shows the ship concentrations in the southern Yellow Sea, through the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and extends deep into the Pacific. This deployment doesn't have any official announcement, no major PLA exercises, and that adds obviously to the regional unease, making the scale look deliberate and not just routine. Now, Japan and China are already in a diplomatic breakdown after Japan's prime minister stated that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could trigger a Japanese military response. That could be a big deal. Well, you don't have much time left. It's Medicare open enrollment season, that magical time of the year when the government hands you a stack of fine print, 24,000 plan options, literally, and a 3-week deadline to somehow not ruin your retirement. Most people throw darts at the wall and pick a random plan and end up paying thousands of dollars more every year. It's basically the Super Bowl of stupidity. Here's a better idea. Call Chapter. They're the only national Medicare advisors who actually compare every single plan, all 24,000 of them. Their advisors are on salary, which means they don't make a dime extra for shoving you into a garbage plan. They work for you and not for the insurance companies. You'll talk to a real human being when you call them. Patient, honest, shockingly helpful. They'll walk you through everything in under an hour, and it's free. It's fast, and they'll even tell you if you're already in the right plan. So no pressure, no nonsense. Unless you just love paying too much and losing your doctor, pick up the phone. Call 636-812-6714. That's 636-812-6714. Medicare open enrollment is open right now, but it closes December 7th. And when it closes, that's it. So don't be the person that waits until it's too late. Call Chapter right now. Now, I did a story about that when I went to Japan in 2023, because Japan was already expecting to have to go to war with China. And they, at that time, said they expected it to happen in 2027 or early 2028. That is still the thought, but if that is the prevailing knowledge, then it wouldn't surprise me if China decided to move up the timeline if they felt like there was a window of time that they could do that and actually strike harder or surprise their enemies before they were ready. But like I say, Japan has been getting ready for some time. Check out this. It's a fairly long piece, but it's worth watching because everything in it is still 100% relevant to what we're talking about. Take a listen.
Japanese and American troops are preparing for possible military action. These joint exercises, which took place in June, are the largest held on Japanese soil since World War II. Increasing threats from China have the entire Pacific Rim worried the Red Army could soon move on Taiwan, less than 140 miles from Japan's shores. In the same area, Chinese Coast Guard ships have been encroaching on Japanese waters almost weekly. As a counter, U.S., Japanese, and Philippine Coast Guard ships also held maneuvers in June. Ishigaki Island, a popular Japanese tourist destination, could soon become a battleground. More soldiers are being moved to bases in the south of Japan.
This new military base just opened here on Ishigaki Island. It's one of the closest ones to the Chinese coast and to Taiwan. It's one of 4 bases that's been built recently to counter the threat from China. This one will be home to more than 500 troops. Most of the people on this island are very pro-military and very happy to have this here, but some people are not, and it's not so much the base itself, it's the kind of troops that they plan to station here.
Locals have been staging protests here because they fear the presence of Japanese artillery batteries would only make the island a target.
Some say it will increase tensions, but I believe it is necessary to strengthen our defenses.
This former Japanese general agrees.
If Taiwan is annexed, the Chinese army will be stationed there, and we could lose control of the sea lanes that provide 60% of Japan's energy and 40% of its food. So there is already an emergency in Taiwan, and an emergency in Taiwan is an emergency in Japan.
But that doesn't mean Japan is looking for a fight.
The rise of China is causing alarm in democratic governments. China is going to lose. China is a godless, militantly atheist country that took over first by massacring its own people. Genocide is the communist way of life, and it's particularly the Chinese communist way of life. I'm reading now the former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo's, he was assassinated last year. I'm reading his memoirs that were released posthumously, and he makes that point in his memoirs that Japan needs to do more to shoulder the burden of liberal democracy, especially vis-a-vis China and places like North Korea and Russia.
No matter how likely there is to be a war, our job is to stop it. To ensure China's president doesn't miscalculate like Putin did. The point is that if China invades Taiwan, the United States and Japan will have the ability to counter that together.
Beijing has reacted pretty sharply to the comments that were made by Tokyo and called them provocative and hostile, fueled their perception that Asia's two largest powers are edging toward confrontation. But it's not just Japan and China. It's China and South Korea, China and the Philippines, China and Vietnam. China is pretty much against everybody. China is in it for China, and that's all. Now, when it comes to taking over Taiwan, regional security officials believe that the massed Chinese fleet serves multiple purposes. First of all, they're intimidating Taiwan, signaling to Japan, just flexing their muscles, probing the United States and allied response patterns, right? They want to see how they respond to this, and then rehearsing for a blockade or some kind of encirclement scenario or something like that. The absence of public statements about this 100-ship armada that's offshore there just suggests that this is more like gray zone pressure. It's not declared drills, they're just flexing their muscles. It's more of a show of force. The distribution of the ships mirrors past Chinese patterns that are associated with things like coercion, including Coast Guard vessels that accompany naval groups to blur the line between civilian and military actions. This is something we've seen all across that region by China as they've intentionally encroached on the shorelines of their adversaries, not just Taiwan and Japan, but the Philippines and South Korea as well. Japan, Taiwan, and several Southeast Asian governments are increasingly raising their readiness levels because analysts are warning that a miscalculation in those waters could really trigger a rapid escalation and outright war. So this is already a problem. It's been a problem for years, but it's hotter now than it was before. And it's not likely, but possible that China might try to pull something on Taiwan sooner than everybody thinks. China has been ramping up their production of naval vessels. They can produce so many more naval vessels than we can, something like 40 or 50 ships a year that they can build, where the United States has a hard time cranking out one or two. And a lot of that just comes down to regulations, safety regulations and all that we have in the United States. They don't labor under any kind of safety regulations in China at all. And on top of that, the blurring of the lines between the Chinese Navy and civilian vessels, this is something that China is doing around the world. There's a huge fleet of fishing boats that belong to China. China actually has about 40% of all of the fishing boats on planet Earth. One country, 40% of all the fishing boats on planet Earth, they can't because Chinese love seafood. There's a massive demand for seafood in China, and they cannot just fish out of their own waters because they have polluted and overfished their own waters to the point where there's almost no fish left in what you would call the China economic zone offshore, 200 miles offshore from China. So what they do is they send out thousands of ships all around the world, and they overfish everybody else's exclusive economic zones, like Peru. So this shadow fleet, here's a graphic. This show, the red dots are Chinese fishing vessels, and this is offshore of Peru. They're not staying outside that exclusive economic zone. What they do is they congregate outside, then they turn off their transponders so they're untraceable, and they go inside Peruvian waters. They steal essentially fish from the Peruvian waters, take them offshore. If you see over here, you see these ships, they make a beeline out here to the middle of the ocean and they congregate out there for a little bit. What's happening is they are transferring the fish that they've caught in Peruvian waters to refrigerated reefer ships out in the middle of the ocean. They do that because it helps to muddy the water, so to speak, and make it harder to track where fish comes from. So this fish doesn't just end up in China, although most of it does. This fish actually ends up in the United States as well, and in Canada and in Europe. The thing is, China doesn't follow any rules. China is a lawless country. As you heard in my piece there, that professor I was interviewing was saying that China is a godless country. I've always said that the motto in China should be, if you're not cheating, you're not trying. If you get caught, you're not trying hard enough. And because you see so much outright fraud, rule breaking, espionage, corporate and otherwise, all across the world coming from China, that it is part and parcel of who they are as a nation. China cheats. China is working overtime to become a global hegemon by means of corporate espionage, industrial espionage, military espionage, and yes, even cultural espionage in the United States. They're funding these institutes called the Confucius Institutes at universities all across the United States. Now, Gordon Chang has been on my show before, and he was on Fox talking about the 660,000 Chinese students that Trump wanted to let into the country on educational visas. And take a listen to what he had to say.
It seems that you and I have been talking about this kind of story, I don't know, 20 years? This has been going on for years, yet all we hear is about how great it is to have Chinese students in the United States of America. No offense, I'm sure they're great Chinese students, but this is a threat that, frankly, we don't need and we shouldn't be tolerating.
Certainly. And we know that about 13% or so of those Chinese students engage in espionage. When you consider that in 2024, there were 277,000 Chinese nationals in our school, 13% is a big number. And it's especially a big number if you double that, as President Trump had talked about. But the other thing, of course, is that we have seen at the University of Michigan now this year 2 incidents of Chinese trying to bring in genetically modified pathogens. Those were dangerous to our food supply. This is a biological weapons attack. These were weapons of mass destruction. This was an attack on the United States. And unfortunately, the Chinese nationals are only going to get light sentences. And matter of fact, one of them from June was actually removed from the U.S. after she pled guilty. We should be sending these people to Guantanamo because these are enemy combatants.
So Gordon's talking there about the espionage going both directions. So not only are Chinese students and other Chinese people, any Chinese person anywhere is subject to being tagged by the government of China and saying, you're a spy now, you need to give us go get what we want or do what we want. So the Chinese students in the United States were caught not only stealing secrets from universities, university labs and research facilities, things like that, but also bringing in biological agents that could literally wipe out the food supply in the United States. It's not just Chinese students doing it, it's Chinese businessmen. And there have been lots of incidents where they were caught bringing things in or stealing things and trying to take them out. And not only do they cheat, but they don't treat their own people very well either. China is known for very serious humanitarian rights abuses, not just against people like the Uyghurs, but just against everybody in China. And there are something like 8 million people that are employed on the 57,000 fishing vessels that China has all around the world. At least 6,500 of those travel outside of China's economic zone to other places. So these far fishing expeditions. And these boats, by the way, are wholly owned by the whole industry in China. Is owned by the CCP. These are not private fishing boats. They subsidize the fuel and everything like that to make it more profitable for them to fish in places where it's already not profitable for capitalistic societies to fish there. But then what they're doing is they're fishing these things down to the point of extinction. And they're doing it not with long lines and nets. Very often what they're doing is fishing with cyanide. They throw cyanide in the water, kills everything, and they just scoop everything up and take it back to China. Now, they also do this on these 57,000 ships that go worldwide by employing forced labor. And there are stories that have been put out by investigative journalists on the internet about this. It's horrific. It's modern day slavery is what it is. It points out that not only, as I said, is that fish going to China, it's going to the United States. And there's not really any way for you to know where the provenance of the fish that you're eating came from. Again, the way China does this with these offshore ship-to-ship transfers, they can spoof where the fish has come from. China is using these men that work on these ships as forced labor. They're torturing people, throwing them overboard. Many of them are told they're not allowed to leave. They have their papers confiscated. It goes far beyond the blockade or training drills or whatever that China is doing offshore. Now, one other thing that I wanted to point out is there's an Economist article that talked about how people in China are assisting the Mexican drug cartels with money laundering. So there are export controls in China that don't allow you to export more than, I think, $50,000 in currency. If you're a rich person in China and you want to buy an apartment in New York, for example, you've got to be able to get that money to the United States, but China will only let you send out $50,000, so that's not enough. What these wealthy people in China are doing is they contact the Mexican drug cartels through a shadow broker, like an underground bank in China, and they transfer, let's say that the flat in New York is going to cost them $1 million. They transfer the $1 million to this underground banker in China. The underground banker then contacts the drug cartel in Mexico and says, what do you guys need? And the drug cartel says, well, we need $1 million worth of precursor chemicals so that we can make more fentanyl to send in the United States. He buys the precursor chemicals, ships them to Mexico. The cartel takes delivery of the $1 million worth of precursor chemicals, and then the cartel gives the Chinese family that started this whole thing the money in cash, and that US cash is now clean laundered, and then they can use it to buy their apartment or land next to an air base or a military facility. We know that the Chinese have been buying up lots of land around US military bases. That is how they are paying for things like that. It is through this complicated money laundering process that leaves no paper trail and makes it almost impossible to figure out where exactly the money came from for these things. There's also a tremendous number of illegal marijuana grows in the United States. The people that raid these illegal marijuana grows, California, Washington, Oregon, places like that, they find very often that they are staffed and run by illegal Chinese immigrants who are basically slaves. They've had their paperwork taken away. They're kept out on the farm. If they get too belligerent or too demanding, their masters just murder them and dump them in a ditch and fill it in a shallow grave. Now, with that in mind, all of the things that I've just shown you, China building up its military forces, threatening its neighbors, threatening global stability, threatening the global supply chain, because Taiwan produces computer chips that we all need. And not only that, but working to assist Russia in their war against Ukraine by sending them lots of computer hardware and cameras and other elements that they need to build their drones that they're using to kill Ukrainians every day. The things that they're doing with the Uyghurs and Christians. As a matter of fact, keep that in mind as we watch this clip from President Trump meeting with President Xi on October 30th.
Very much. It's a great honor to be with a friend of mine, really for a long time now, if you think about it. The very, very distinguished and respected President of China, and we will be having some discussions. I think we've already agreed to a lot of things, and we'll agree to some more right now. But President Xi is a great leader of a great country, and I think we're going to have a fantastic relationship for a long period of time. And it's an honor to have you with us. Thank you very much.
I understand that President Trump's trying to be diplomatic here, and you don't walk into a meeting with a foreign leader and immediately start attacking him. This effusive pandering to Xi, oh, he's a great man, a great leader, of a great country and have absolutely nothing to say about the human rights abuses, any of the espionage that's taken place against the United States, the fentanyl coming into the United States. No, what makes me feel like President Trump doesn't actually believe that Xi is a great leader and a great man is because President Trump has spoken pretty harshly about the Chinese in terms of the fentanyl that's coming into the United States. But he's always looking to make a deal. President Trump is very transactional. And with that in mind, he's sitting down with President Xi trying to see what he can extract from Xi. But it's just gross to watch him flatter a guy like that. It's just pretty gross.